Got another streamer pattern this week. This is the Blanton's Whistler. It is often referred to as the Blanton's Flashtail Whistler because of all the flash in it. It gets the name Whistler from the Beadchain eyes that are up in front, which tend to, as you're casting this and it is flying through the air, tend to whistle a little bit sometimes. I came across this pattern, a good 12 years ago or so, when I was getting ready for a trip up to the Quetico Provincial Park in Canada for some early season pike in May. And I tied these up on a 3-aught hook, maybe a 4 or 5 inch long pattern, big old streamer flies for some large pike. The thing that I found is it worked great for pike. It goes anywhere a foot or so down below the surface, but it also worked excellent for smallmouth. The same exact fly, getting it about anywhere from 7 to 10 feet down that time of year. I was picking up 4 and 5 pound smallmouth with this fly. So it is a all-around nice versatile pattern. There is a nice article Dan Blanton wrote about how he came up with this pattern and the uses for it, and I have a link down in the description below to that article. It's a fairly straightforward tie, not a whole lot to it. Again, you can tie it without, the original did not have the flash in it, but the Flashtail Whistler, or this particular version, is very, very versatile. If you search around, you'll find lots of variations in terms of color, and even some body material and other materials that people have used in this to good effect, I guess. So anyway, that is the Blanton's Whistler, or the Flashtail Whistler, and we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start the Blanton's Whistler by placing our hook on the vise. This is a Mustad C52S in a size 1. Another good hook for this particular fly would be, say, a Tiemco 8089. The size really depends on the species that you're going for. I found that a size 1 or 1/0 for smallmouth and pike works pretty well. If you're specifically going to go for larger pike, then I might even go up to a 2/0 or 3/0. But this works well. For thread, I'm going to be using a UTC 70 Denier in a red, and I'll explain why in just a little bit. It may seem a little bit light for this particular fly. I'm going to attach my thread right behind the eye of the hook, and I'm just going to go back a few turns to secure that. I don't want to go too far from behind the eye of the hook. That's what I'm going to tie in the bead chain. For this particular size hook, I'm using a large. This is a bead chain, silver bead chain in a size large. I'm going to clip a couple of beads off and tie those in so that the cross piece, which is right between the two balls, is going to be about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. This will set me up nicely for enough space behind the eye to secure everything, to do a few cross wraps over the eyes and around the eyes with the material to smooth things off. A few wraps under the eyes and over the hook shank to secure those. And then I'm going to draw my thread out and bring it alongside the hook shank and hang my bobbin on the back of my vise. That's because I'm going to put some thread wraps on here. I just find that this method is easier than, say, putting the thread wraps on first, then trying to put your eyes on. For me, this just works a little bit better. For the lead wraps, I'm using a .030 lead free. You can certainly use a regular lead if you want. I'm going to put about 10 wraps, maybe 12 wraps, right along the hook shank. Went with 12 on that one. I'm going to smooth those out. And then we're going to push those right up behind the bead chain eyes. Taking my thread back. I'm going to anchor my thread right behind just with a little bit of a thread dam, and then bring my thread forward, back and forth across the lead just a little bit to secure that in. Understand the key to tying this fly is that everything is tied right on top of these lead wraps. I don't want to go further back. So with my thread hanging right at the back end of those lead wraps, I'm going to tie in my first material. The tail is made up of bucktail, some flash, and a couple of hackles. This is just a white bucktail. The original Blanton's Whistler had 3 clumps of bucktail in it. I prefer to just tie in 2. Its method was to tie in a clump of bucktail and then some flash, another clump of bucktail, then some Flashabou, and then the last clump of bucktail. I just put both the flash right in the middle. I'm going to measure, after I cut and clean that, I'm going to measure my bucktail for about 2 hook lengths. Don't have to be precise on this, but this is a bait fish pattern. I'm going to tie that in so that it almost extends the full length of those lead wraps. You'll see why in just a second. Put in a number of wraps. Remember, I don't want to go past the back of the lead wraps here. And this is part of the reason I'm using the smaller diameter thread, because all these all of these thread wraps to bind all these materials in don't build up and get too bulky, which is easy to do. I'm going to put some head cement along this, and this just helps to soak down in there, bind this all together a little bit. Whether you're fishing for pike or whether you're fishing for smallmouth, or even if you're fishing for saltwater species, stripers or something like that with this, adding a little head cement as you go along is going to help to just secure that a little bit more, because these are pretty aggressive fish. I'm using 2 different types of flash in this. I'm using some pearl crystal flash or flash accent, which is the first flash that I'm going to tie in. This batch is kind of ratty, so I'm just pulling a nice chunk out. You can see it's kind of all over the place, and that's fine, because what you're looking for is just a whole bunch of flash in this. And it doesn't have to look pretty. First thing I'm going to do is to trim this flash accent right down the length of the tail. And then I'm going to fold the front part back, binding that down, and I'm going to trim this, but I'm going to trim this about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch beyond the tail. And when I trim this, I'm actually trimming these out at different lengths, not just straight across. What this is going to do is help these by having all these different lengths through here. The ends of these are what are going to flutter a lot and add a lot of flash to this fly. With that done, I'm going to tie in my Flashabou. I'm using a holographic silver Flashabou for this. I'm going to take a nice thick clump of this Flashabou. Some people will use different types of flash. You could use a pearl flash. whatever your preferred flash is for these things, but just making it nice and flashy is what it's all about. I'm going to tie this in and kind of do the same thing. I'm going to bring these up shorter so they're near the tail. I'm going to bind that in, and then before folding this back, any of these longer fibers that are longer than the tail, I'm going to go ahead and trim off a little bit. And then fold back the other half of the Flashabou, binding that down. Again, note I'm not going past the back end of those lead wraps. And this one also about an inch behind the tail, I'm just going to cut at different lengths. You could back off on some of the flash if you want to, but I find, again, that's one of the major attractors of this particular pattern. I'm going to bind all that down and put some head cement on it. Yes, my thread just kind of popped off there. But we'll go ahead and bind that down. Put some head cement all on that again to soak down in there. Make that a little bit more secure. Then I'm going to put in my second clump of bucktail. You can make these a little thicker if you want. I tend to like them just a little bit thinner. Take your second clump and clean it, and we're going to just tie this in the same length as the first one, but this time I want this to go all the way up to right behind the bead chain. This is going to give me a nice smooth body, underbody for the hackles I have to tie in, and then for the body chenille that I have to palmer, as well as our Schlappen. Just take your time and go ahead, get this nice and smooth. It's worth it. Throw some more head cement on that. Careful not to go past your underlying lead wraps, and that's the foundation for our body. Blanton's Whistler has a couple of hackles that are tied on each side. I'm using a whiting American saddle. This is a Grizzly, a dyed tan. Generally, just a regular Grizzly's fine. I'm using the dyed tan because I just want it a little bit more subdued. You're going to take two feathers that are at least going to be the length of the bucktail. We're going to prep those feathers by matching them up. And then mostly you just want to get those tips nice and even. Then we're going to strip off some of the fluff, not too much just yet, because we want to measure this. My tail extends to right about here. I want the tips to go to that tail, but I also want to leave this on. I don't want to tie in a bare stem. If I try to tie in this bare stem, what tends to happen is the hackles tend to rotate one way or another. If you just leave, for this particular fly, you can do this. If you just leave some of these fibers onto the stem so that when you wrap this on, you're wrapping down those fibers. It will keep that from rotating on you. And it is not going to make a bit of difference in terms of the action and or the look of the fly. But it is going to make a big difference in terms of being easier for you to tie this fly. See, it just lays right on the side, no problem, no twists or anything. Secure that in, and then we go to the other side. Same procedure. I match up the tips. I'm going to tear off some of the fluff down here. Cut away the stem a little bit so that I can measure. That one's just a little bit. I can get some of this fluff off. Even if some of that fluff is still on there, that's fine. It's not going to affect the fly, and as you'll see in a moment, the overall look of the fly will be the same, and the action. So we'll wrap those in, and as you can see, it's laying nice and along the side. I'm going to try and wrap all of this down so I have a smooth underbody. Again, that's where the smaller diameter thread comes in handy. You don't end up building a huge bulky underbody. Again, a little more head cement right on there, holds that in place. This head cement is a fly-tight head cement. It's a alcohol-based. It's a little thinner than most head cements. I wouldn't say that it's kind of like a lacquer or anything to or varnish to build up. It's more that it soaks down into the threads and the materials and then binds them and kind of fuses all of them together. So it helps make this fly very sturdy and last much longer. So now we're going to tie in our body material, which is some chenille, and our Schlappen hackle and our Blanton's Whistler will be done. The main body of our Whistler fly here is going to be some medium red chenille. Larger hooks, if you're tying on a 1/0 or say a 2/0 or 3/0, I'd go to a large chenille. This is just to take up some space here for the Schlappen hackle, which is our collar. I'm going to pull off some fluff off the end of this chenille. I'll tie that core in. Secure it. Bring my thread halfway down the body, because I'm only going to put in 2 to maybe 3 wraps of this chenille. And that, again, is to cover up those thread wraps and just start to take up some space for the body and leaving us half that space for our collar. For the collar on this, I'm using some Schlappen in a red. Red is probably the predominant color for these Whistler flies. You'll find a lot of different color patterns that other people tie these in, but the original was a red and white. So I'm using a Schlappen simply because I like how it folds back. You could certainly use a saddle hackle if you want to instead. I'm going to go ahead and leave most of the fluff on here simply because it's easier. I'm going to grab this by the tip and stroke those fibers back. It's kind of a sloppy collar, and that's fine. I'm going to cut some of that tip off, leaving myself a nice little triangle to tie that in and secure it. And notice I'm putting a number of thread wraps and touching turns all along there to secure that very well. I don't want that coming out while I'm wrapping this in. Put some head cement down here to secure that. That will also wrap in with the hackle at the base and the stem to make that a little bit more solid. Now we're just palmering. We got each wrap going to go in right in front of the other wrap. If you can, fold these back so that they're out of the way, then go ahead. Sometimes I find that process, especially when the fibers are so short, a little more challenging. It's just as easy to stroke the fibers back out of the way every wrap that you're putting in. The feather twists around on you. I don't get too concerned about it. I'm more concerned about this getting wrapped in and those fibers getting stroked backwards so that they're all flowing back in a nice collar. Start to get to some of the longer fibers here. It can be a little easier to fold those back and keep them back. Now I've got most of the feather in there, and now I'm getting to the fluffy parts. I like to go ahead and put in a turn or two sometimes with the fluffy parts of the feather, simply because I think it adds a little more life and a little bit more body to it. Once I have all my wraps in, I'll secure those. Trim away the excess. Stroke all this back. Put some wraps down right behind the Beadchain eyes to secure that hackle real well. That's all it takes. Then you'll want to do some crisscross wraps between the Beadchain eyes to kind of fill in that space with some thread wraps. There's a lot of space, kind of a gap in there that needs to be filled just a little bit to transition down to the eye of the hook. Give this a nice little pronounced nose. And you can use your thread to do that. Once you have that done, bring your thread right up to the front of the Beadchain eyes behind the eye of the hook. Just fill that space in with some turns, just to smooth that out a little bit. And then when you got that done, put in a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. Trim away your thread. Soak up those thread wraps right behind around the Beadchain and everything right up front here real well with some head cement. You want that to soak down in there so that it binds all those threads and everything together really, really well. You could probably, even if you wanted to use some sort of thin UV resin or something on there, that would also help. Mostly it's going to protect this from teeth and maybe banging around on rocks and things like that. But that is the Blanton's Whistler. Collar usually is going to end up somewhere about just behind the bend of the hook, maybe a little bit shorter. But as you can see, it covers up the chenille and it covers up the side of those hackles. So tying those in the way we did, it makes no difference. But it makes a difference because it's easier for you. As I said in the beginning, it's a great pike fly. It's a real good smallmouth fly. If I were tying some from my local waters around here, this one's a little bit on the large size. I'd stick probably with somewhere around a 1 to 2 inch fly. So I might even go down to a size 2 or 4 hook and just shorten the body up a little bit. But for bigger waters with bigger fish, this is a great size, or even a little bit longer. I've tied these, like I said, on 2 and 3/0 hooks that are 5-inch long baitfish patterns. It casts really well. It will sink just down below the surface. Because of the deer hair, the bucktail and everything, it doesn't sink really, really well, but it does get down a good foot or two below the surface, and just overall, great little baitfish fly. That's the Blanton's Whistler. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.